Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jessica Berman. I'm the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities here at UMBC, and I'm so pleased to see this great turnout. Folks from campus, folks from off campus, here for this really important panel on gentrification in Baltimore. And before we get started, I just want to first of all thank our sponsors. So in addition to the Drescher Center, this event is sponsored by the American Studies Department, the Political Science Department, and the Critical Social Justice Program at the Women's Center at UMBC. So thank you to all of those units for supporting this important conversation. I also want to tell you a little bit about our upcoming talk on Thursday, May 3rd. This will be the Lipitz Lecture, a really significant named lecture on campus, offered by Carol McCann, who's professor and chair of Gender and Women's Studies at UMBC, and she'll be talking about Planned Parenthood in Maryland as a vital community resource. She's engaged in a research project that marks the 90th anniversary of Planned Parenthood in Maryland, and is working in the Planned Parenthood archives, and is going to be talking to you or to us about her important research in this archive and on that important group. So I hope you will try to come back for that. And again, it's Thursday, May 3rd, 4 p.m. right here. I will say this is the end of a really terrific spring season. We are putting wraps on our plans for next year. We have a flyer if anyone wants to see what's been on this spring, but I hope that you will turn to the Drescher Center website as we get closer to fall, and you take a look at what we have on offer next fall and spring. We're doing a lot of work to make sure that our talks are always timely, very informative, and interesting both to campus communities and the public. So we hope you'll come back. We invite you to follow us on Facebook, to follow us on Twitter, at UMBC Humanities. And if you're interested in tweeting today, the hashtag is HumForum18. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Amy Bott, who is Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and also affiliate faculty in Asian Studies as well as Language, Literacy, and Culture here at UMBC. I'm supposed to also announce, sorry, I forgot. Students of Professor Hernandez, there is a sign-in sheet, and Courtney Hobson, who's sitting right here in the striped shirt, is the one who's got the sheet. So if you're supposed to sign in, please find her at the end of the talk. And now, Amy Bott.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce our panelists. So I'm not going to do too much framing. I think that many of us are here to talk about the very important issues around gentrification in Baltimore City. And the panelists that we have today work on these issues from a multiplicity of perspectives. So I am going to introduce our panelists and then let them do their thing. And we shall hear from each one of them for about 5 minutes, have some questions that they'll address as a whole, and then we'll open up to discussion. So the idea here is to hopefully have a rich and robust conversation this afternoon. Today we will hear from Lawrence Brown, who is the grandson of Mississippi Delta sharecroppers and preachers. He is a native of West Memphis, Arkansas, and moved to Baltimore in the fall of 2010. His current research addresses the impact of historical trauma on community health. He's a racial equity consultant, an organizer with Baltimore Block, a co-founder of the Lead Poisoning Awareness Initiative #BeMoreLeadFree, and an associate professor at Morgan State University in the School of Community Health and Policy. Our next speaker is Felipe Filomeno, who is an assistant professor of political science and global studies at UMBC. He holds a PhD in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University, where he was a Fulbright scholar. His current research investigates the local dimensions of immigration, politics, and policy with a focus on the Latin American diaspora in Baltimore. His latest book, Theories of Local Immigration Policy, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. We're also pleased to be joined today by Seema Iyer, who is Associate Director and Research Assistant Professor for the Jacob France Institute in the University of Baltimore's Merrick School of Business. Dr. Iyer has overseen the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance since 2011, and she's the co-chair of and teaches in the University of Baltimore's Real Estate and Economic Development program. Prior to joining UB, Dr. Iyer served as the Chief of Research and Strategic Planning for Baltimore City's Planning Department, where she spearheaded the city's 2010 Census Complete Count campaign, as well as other planning processes such as the 2009 Food Policy Task Force. She holds a PhD in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, specializing in comprehensive and strategic planning for community development. And finally, we'll hear today from Nicole King, who is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of American Studies and the Director of the Orser Center for the Study of Place, Community, and Culture here at UMBC. Her teaching and research interests focus on the issue of place, power, and economic development. Dr. King's scholarship analyzes changes to the social and built environment during the rise of consumer culture in the 20th century, such as the decline of industrial neighborhoods in Baltimore. Dr. King has recently co-edited Baltimore Revisited, Rethinking and Remaking a Right to the City, which is a collection of articles on Baltimore's social history, which is forthcoming with Rutgers University Press. So I'd like to invite our panelists to join us here. We'll hear from each one of them, and perhaps we'll just go in order of the introduction. So we'll start with Dr. Brown first. We'll hear a little bit about their work and then open up to a question and answer period next.
All right, good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Y'all heard that song by Grandmaster Flash? Don't push me, cause I'm close. Yeah, all right. We're on our way, so y'all help me out when that comes up. So I situate gentrification with colonization. I situate gentrification with a long history of serial forced displacement. So that starts with how North America looked 500 or so years ago when this was a place that did not yet have European settlers located on the continent. Then we have to think about the forced displacement of 10.5 million Africans from the coast of Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. 12 million got on the boat, only 10.5 million got off the boat. So that tells you about what happened in the middle. Then we have to think about the way in which, actually there was a second displacement for African Americans during the rise of cotton around 1800 from the mid-Atlantic Chesapeake region where you have Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, states like that. When cotton was taken off, African Americans were taken to the Deep South for labor to help Southern planters and slave masters. Then you have to think about the Great Migration. Did black people leave the Deep South willingly? La, 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 I just want to go north. Or was something else going on? Perhaps 4,000 lynchings between 1877 and 1950, as the Equal Justice Institute says. Or maybe there was 100 or so destruction of black communities or economic districts in the Deep South as well. So forced displacement is happening over and over and over again. The lynchings all across the Deep South as black people leave the Deep South. Between 1910 and 1970, over 6.5 million black people leave the South due to racial terror. So again, Grandmaster Flash, don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. And there's a map. Leon Hogan, a scholar in Ireland, has online that you can look at. Two prominent examples are Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, the destruction of Black Greenwood in Tulsa, and then also Rosewood, 1923, the destruction of that entire black town by white supremacists who committed a mass atrocity in that city. And so where did African Americans go to seek freedom? They came to places like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Louisville, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and they went west as well, California, Kansas, places like that to find freedom. And what did they find when they arrived? They arrived and found redlining. racial segregation, really the weaponization of racial segregation, which Noliwe Rooks, a scholar who wrote a book called Cutting School, she calls it segronomics. The weaponization of racial segregation is, in fact, the economic destruction of a community whereby if you lived in a red community, you could not receive loans because the federal government would not guarantee them. So the federal government created these maps beginning about 1930. And if you read Antero Patella's Not in My Neighborhood, he talks about how these color codes were underpinned by the pseudoscience of eugenics. And so then you have through the 60s, really the 50s and 60s, a process called urban renewal. This process displaced over 25,000 families in Baltimore. So again, we're talking about displacements over and over and over again. Today in Baltimore, and indeed the entire metropolitan area, what do we find? Baltimore is a Category 5 hyper-segregated city, according to Douglas Massey, a sociologist at Princeton University. And so you see what's characteristic of Baltimore, what I call the white L, black butterfly, Asian archipelago, and the Latino lagoon. We are very much still in 2010 a hyper-segregated city. And where is the capital going? Between 1990 and 2000 to the Inner Harbor. Between 2000 and the present, we see just outside of the harbor and also down the center of Baltimore, that's that white L. So capital is flowing into the L, not really the black butterfly, facilitating gentrification in places like Hamden, Reservoir Hill, Patterson Park, Hollingtown, where our Latino community is located, Pigtown, Waterfront, Stadium area. Looking at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition maps, where's the capital going for home purchase lending and small businesses? Those bigger dots represent higher levels of investment and capital. You see that's also in that L. So gentrification is facilitated by the capital investments of not only private entities like banks, but also public entities like the city of Baltimore. This is a map of TIF and pilots. These are economic tools used by the city. And again, you can see down the center and along the coast, that's where investment is given. So I want to leave you with the thought that gentrification is not just private action. It's facilitated, it's incentivized, it's subsidized by the public sector, our city government in Baltimore City, if you live there. Especially this grant program, Live Near Your Work. It's a powerful tool for gentrification. And so this is why I say, don't push me, cause I'm close to the.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to speak about gentrification from the perspective of the community that I do research with, which is the Latino community in Southeast Baltimore. Baltimore has seen growth in the immigrant population for several years now, several decades actually. If you look here at the numbers from the 2000 census in comparison to the most recent statistics, we see how the proportion of immigrants in Baltimore jumped from 4.55% to 7.81%. And that's a dramatic growth if you consider that the population of Baltimore has been declining over that period. So an absolute growth of just about 64% in the total number of immigrants in Baltimore. And immigrants don't spread even across the urban space. They tend to be concentrated. Here I have a map showing the percentage of foreign-born population per neighborhood. So the darker the red, the higher the proportion of immigrants living in that area. So you can see there, Southeast Baltimore, the Latino community. In South Baltimore as well, we have a significant concentration of Latinos. Then other immigrant communities concentrate in downtown Baltimore. You also see a concentration of foreign-born individuals in around the Homewood campus on North Baltimore. There on the northeast, you see the Moravia Road corridor, where several refugee families have been resettled over the years, right? Now, keep in mind this map and where foreigners tend to be concentrated in the city. I'm going to jump to the map of gentrification in Baltimore here. In dark blue, you see the neighborhoods of Baltimore that have been gentrified from 2000 to 2009-13. If you remember that previous map, there is a significant overlap between areas that have been gentrified and areas where you see lots of immigrants. And that begs the question of, are immigrants contributing to gentrification? Are immigrants maybe priming neighborhoods for gentrification? I will argue that there is only an element of truth in there, because immigrants have actually been displaced by gentrification. And I can show you some numbers now, but it's something that I can discuss further later. This is rent in 3 neighborhoods of Southeast Baltimore in comparison to Baltimore as a whole. On the left, you see the numbers for 2010. On the right, the more recent numbers for 2017. You can see that all the ratios increase, showing that Southeast Baltimore has become more expensive in comparison to the rest of Baltimore. Now, keep in mind these numbers, so housing costs increasing. Indicators of ethnic and racial diversity in those neighborhoods decreasing over the same period. So you can see there how gentrification is associated with declining ethnic diversity. Latino population as a percentage of the total population, and then on the right, the racial diversity index, always in relation to the same index for the city as a whole. So you can see how it's been declining. Those neighborhoods in Southeast Baltimore are still among our global neighborhoods. They're still very much diverse in comparison to the rest of Baltimore, but they are becoming less so in part because of gentrification. And later I can show you more slides and discuss more details of that.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here with my esteemed panelists. It's going to be a great evening of listening, hopefully not too much talking by me. What I wanted to mention was that I oversee a project called the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, which I don't know if anybody here about the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance? Okay, well, I will tell you a little about it, because what we do is we try and assess key quality of life, community-based indicators for every neighborhood in the city of Baltimore to try and understand what makes for a healthy neighborhood. That's our job. We pull out data, put it into the hands of communities. How many people have been to the doctor recently and gotten your blood work done, and you get this battery of tests? I'm not a medical doctor, but my doctor tells me, hey, you know, your blood levels are out of range. That should be, or your hemoglobin levels are out of range. It should be between 6 and 11 mmGs. I don't even know what that means. And if it's below that, I know I need to take an iron tablet. I don't exactly know what the mechanism of why that iron tablet is going to make me a healthier person, but I know that that's what I want to do. The science of this is obviously much shorter in the world of trying to understand community-based indicators, but that's what we're after. How do we get to help neighborhoods understand the things that they may not even see that might be out of range? Exactly the type of things that our former 2 panelists have talked about. You don't necessarily see the dollars that are coming into your neighborhoods or the absence of dollars coming into your neighborhoods, but it's because of those structural things that we can see change occurring in our neighborhoods. So let's talk about the 3 key indicators of why we want to try and define gentrification. There's a lot of different ways to define gentrification. I'm going to use a relatively simple way to do it. People generally think of gentrification as being the change in income, change in education, and change in race. So let's look at the neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore that have changed significantly along those 3 different indicators. So change in median income, the top 6 in the last 7 years that have changed in terms of dramatic changes in median income are South Baltimore, Locust Point. This is very similar to the maps that have already been shown. Canton on the west side, on the east side, Fells Point, which is right next door, Inner Harbor, Federal Hill, Patterson Park, Northeast, and Highlandtown. These are all areas around the water, but also have experienced significant public investment, including road reconstruction along Boston Street, that has led to I-95, kind of opening up these areas for people to even have easy access to these neighborhoods. In the south, access to Key Highway leading to I-95 in the south. If anybody's been to these neighborhoods, you probably took I-95 to get there and had a pretty easy time to get there. So that's change in median income, extreme changes, more than 30% change in median income in these 6 neighborhoods. So which ones have experienced a change in education? Of those 6, it's Highlandtown, South Baltimore, which is Locust Point, and Patterson Park again. So those 3 have something in common, both a change in income and a change in educational levels. So then we look at race. Which ones have experienced a change in the percentage of the white population, which is an irony in a city that's 63% African American to have neighborhoods that are changing drastically in their white population. And these are Highlandtown, South Baltimore again, reading the wrong list. Patterson Park was number 1 in change in white population, Fells Point and Highlandtown. They're all in, this is non-Hispanic white population. So these 3 indicators, we have a set of a few neighborhoods that have actually changed in either 1, 2, or 3 of these key ways that people talk about gentrification. But the indicator that I want to talk about is actually one that, again, you don't really think about, but is the key to gentrification. You cannot have gentrification without just more people moving in, period, right? Population growth is a necessary condition for gentrification to even happen. And in a city that has experienced significant population loss for the last 6 decades, even having neighborhoods that are growing at all is a pressure situation, because there are very few, unfortunately, that are experiencing this kind of public investment and that are in fact growing. So let's think about the issue of population change. If you are a neighborhood that is growing, remaining stable, or declining, in a city that was built out by the 1950s, we're going to have one of these 3 situations, right? Every neighborhood was already built out by 1950, and one of these 3 conditions occur today. So in a growing neighborhood, when it's too fast, what are you going to hear about? You're going to hear about the issues related to increased retail, because retail will follow growth. They'll follow the people. If there are more households, they're going to sell you more stuff. And believe it or not, you actually get an increase in property crime and crimes of opportunity that occur in areas of growth. Our fastest growing neighborhood is the downtown, and that's our number 1 incident for crime-related property crimes in particular. You're going to hear about congestion, people complaining about parking and not having enough space to put their car. You're going to hear about the rise in housing. Why? Because you have a demand for a limited supply in a neighborhood, and you're going to hear about fear of displacement in neighborhoods that are experiencing excessive growth. In our more stable neighborhoods, you may not necessarily hear the same things. You're going to hear about things about how can I continue to market my neighborhood so that whenever I'm ready to sell, someone wants to pick it up. How can I continue to rehabilitate my housing stock? How is it worth me bumping out the kitchen so that whenever I do go to sell, someone will buy it? You hear about school quality, you hear about maintenance-related issues in our stable neighborhoods. And in our declining neighborhoods, the problems of contracting. Physical contracting of neighborhoods is incredibly difficult. The number 1 indicator for population decline is vacant and abandoned housing, right? But people leave, they don't take their houses with them. And everything that ensues after that. The people that leave are the ones that, either pass away or move away or have some kind of a choice to leave. And the folks that get left behind, we have increasing rates of concentrated poverty. This is the areas that we talk about school closings, right? You have decline in population, you're going to have decline in enrollment, and then this is the place we're talking about food deserts. These 3 kinds of experiences are spatially distributed in exactly similar patterns that previous maps have shown. So these are the neighborhoods that have grown, the ones in green, the ones that are relatively stable in the city of Baltimore, the yellow ones, and the ones that have unfortunately declined in the last 10 years. And you can see, obviously, similar patterns around this notion of pressure in growth, right up and down the spine of Baltimore City and going around the water. And the question is, I've overlaid this with councilmanic districts. We're not organized according to this kind of issue. All of our growing neighborhoods are not organized. They're bifurcated by which council person might represent their area. And if you see, almost every council district has almost all 3 types of neighborhoods. So a council person is hearing all the issues in all the neighborhoods because of the kind of experience that these neighborhoods are having. Except the 9th district. If anybody lives in the 9th district, unfortunately, every neighborhood has experienced population decline. And so this is what I want to talk about. How do we even get neighborhoods that have similar experiences that are unfortunately tribalized by the way we organize ourselves politically to actually band together, advocate, and make sure that they don't experience high rising prices and displacement, and it can actually protect their neighborhood in the future. That's where I'll leave it for now.
Thanks for leaving your map up. I don't have any maps, but I can reference this map. I love all of these maps. And I don't have any slides because really I'm a qualitative researcher, and my research looks at the human side of redevelopment, which is really asking people how they feel. We need to know what's going on, but we need to know how people feel about it. Really, that's super important. So also the connections between deindustrialization in a city like Baltimore and many cities across the U.S. and the globe is directly related to redevelopment. When you have a D, you have a re. A lot of my work was in Brooklyn, Curtis Bay, Fairfield, neighborhoods down here, and what we call extreme South Baltimore, an area of intense deindustrialization where local people fought against an incinerator coming to their area. Gentrification isn't just nice guys in suits. Sometimes it's a corporation. The other neighborhoods that I work in are neighborhoods that are parts of arts districts, Station North, the Bromo, in the west side of downtown where I live. Also, I've started working on public markets because we have a big push in Baltimore, which has a really old public market system, to privatize these markets, especially Lexington Market and now Hollins Market, where my students and my grad students are working right now at the Lyons Brothers building while I'm here, to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do, which is go out and ask people how they feel about gentrification and redevelopment. There recently was released plans of Hollins Market. Warhorse is redeveloping that. Anyone know what Warhorse? Who owns Warhorse? Yes, sir. Yes, one of the Planks, Scott Plank, his brothers Kevin Plank, Under Armour, all of that. The biggest redevelopment in the history of the city is planned Port Covington. I'm sure that'll come up in our discussion. But there was a blog by an architect that had the manager of Warhorse saying, Mill says that, because he asked him, are you worried about gentrification? And Mill said that gentrification involves developing / bringing something in the community that it doesn't want. And he continued, Warhorse is providing a rejuvenated market, which the community needs so desperately. And I just wonder if he asked them and if he talked to them, because that's what me and my students do. So in the rest of my 5 minutes, I just want to give you some words from people that we've talked to. This is Thurman Jennings, and we talked to him one morning in Lexington Market, and we showed him the plans, which is in the zine, Learning from Lexington, of what they're planning to do to Lexington Market. And he said, I'm kind of concerned. I'm very concerned. I don't want it to lose its soul. Oftentimes, when you come across any business, really, you have to consider whether or not it has its natural or original personality. As time goes forward, you lose a lot of that home-style feeling that you would have. It goes commercial. I wouldn't want Lexington Market to go commercial. But I mean, you got to think about business, and who cares about home style when dollars are concerned? Thurston also had this to say about Lexington Market that I think speaks to why we need to really think about redevelopment and ask people on the ground. He was at Joy's getting a $4 breakfast, and he told me and another student, for me, Lexington Market is kind of like an embodiment of the spirit of Baltimore. In Baltimore, you really have the get up and go attitude. A lot of the residents, as far as I've, encountered them, don't necessarily have the easiest ways of succeeding in life. But it's the will, it's the drive that a person has that makes them go out and get and achieve. Lexington Market, you look around at all the businesses, shops, and you look around at all the faces. It's that same spirit, that same drive, that same get up and go. And I don't know what the day will bring, but let's hope for the best. And this man had not even had his coffee or his breakfast yet, and he is so wise. And the final thing I wanted to say, and this came this morning in email, someone who saw this talk was going on. Her name is Nia Redmond, and I hope she's here. Is Nia here by any chance? She's going to try and make it. Maybe she'll show up later. And she wrote about the work her and Catherine Benton-Jones are doing. And she said, we hope that scholars like yourself are aware that most of the time, residents-led groups impacted by redevelopment are low-income women of color. That's who we are. I am still fighting for authentic social justice for over 900 families involuntarily dislocated from the Johns Hopkins University EBDI neighborhood in East Baltimore. Catherine Bennett Jones is engaged in the Perkins Square public housing and Old Mall redevelopment projects, also in East Baltimore. We were just finding out about your lecture. We would greatly appreciate talking with you. She called right before I came here, and we talked on the phone. And she was wonderful, and she talked about a sign that she had at a protest: gentrification stole my history, and I'm pissed. But she has fought to get money to bring that history back. She is recreating it with the East Baltimore Historical Library and a gentrification digital project. And she said, I would love to work with your students. And I said, I hope this is the beginning of many more beautiful conversations to come. This work is collaborative, it's across universities, it's across education levels, it's across all different things. If we are gonna make Baltimore City, if we're gonna fight the planks and the guys in the suits, then we gotta work together. So, thank you.
Thank you all for those really thought-provoking remarks to begin with. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. A few of the questions I had have been covered in our talk. So one of the things that really struck out to me listening to all four of you was the ways in which gentrification as it's being played out in Baltimore is really through a series of contradictions, right? We're talking about investment in certain areas. Thank you. Is that on? Any better? Oh yeah. Hi. All right. Listening to everyone's presentations today, it strikes me that gentrification is really understood and being lived out in Baltimore through a series of contradictions, right? We're talking about investment and divestment, population growth and displacement, branding or reworking of identities, and the erasure of memory and the sort of identities that neighborhoods have had historically. So considering that, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you're defining gentrification. Dr. Iyer gave us a really nice set of indicators, but I want you to maybe give us a little bit of a sense of how you think about it as a useful term or maybe a limiting term for thinking about the future of a city like Baltimore.
All right. Well, I think about, again, gentrification is the last stop in serial forced displacement. And that's why oftentimes when people are displaced due to gentrification, which I would define as the sort of changeover of a community, often by class and race, and also assisted by public subsidy policies or practices. And so it's a part of a long continuum of historical trauma that has been inflicted on communities of color. And that's why people have this sense of like, here we go again, because they haven't been allowed to have stable communities, in particular African-American communities that have been displaced historically. I've counted what I call, in a book that I'm writing, the seven great displacements. And I enumerated a few in my presentation. So I think gentrification is just sort of the last iteration of that, the latest and greatest iteration of that. But you know, it takes different forms. You have like the eminent domain of EBDI, the city of Baltimore and Johns Hopkins that displaced over 730 black families. You have it that way. You also have it the Warhorse Properties sort of way when this big developer comes in, drops a lot of cash, and now people can't afford their property because of rising tax values for those homes. So it happens in different ways, but that's the way I would define it.
So I'm not going to define gentrification based on the indicators that we use to measure it or the potential consequences. I would just remind us of the two definitions of the concept. So the original definition is that gentrification is a process of urban renewal that happens when middle class or upper middle class people move into a previously deteriorated neighborhood, usually in a piecemeal, gradual, grassroots approach as homes are rehabbed, flipped, and then people, they are more affluent, move in. Then more recently, the concept was enlarged to also include the big development projects that also contribute to gentrification, urban revitalization, but with some exclusionary consequences or many exclusionary consequences. And the two things have been observed in Baltimore, sometimes reinforcing each other. So if you think, for instance, about Canton in Southeast Baltimore, many houses being flipped and young, white, affluent couples or individuals moving in. And that happens in the same place where you have, for instance, Canton Crossing, which is that big development on Boston Street, where you have the Target, the Harris Teeter, and other big stores, which also receive, some public incentives. So you see these two processes reinforcing each other in Baltimore. So I do think that it's a useful concept for us.
So this is on, right? Okay, so I actually don't think gentrification by itself is a terribly useful term for all of our neighborhoods. Because look, no neighborhood wants to be declining in population. No neighborhood wants to have people continuously be leaving its neighborhood, right? Think about the neighborhood that you're living in right now. If the house next to you goes out for sale, or somebody moves out and it's being leased and it doesn't get occupied, that is a burden on you, not the empty house, right? You living next door to an empty house is a huge burden. So all of us want that house to be occupied. All of us. In every single one of these neighborhoods, none of us want vacant and abandoned properties, which leads to all kinds of other problems. So if we instead think of empowering neighborhoods, all neighborhoods, to say, you want people to move in. Every single one of our neighborhoods want people to move in, period. Let's get in front of that. Who do you want to move in? Who are you going to call? Who are you going to market your neighborhood to? Can you get in front of the potential deterioration that will happen if people don't move into your neighborhood? And it's because of the unfortunate deterioration, because of a lack of funding, because of this kind of yin and yang of where funding actually goes, that you start to lose political representation when you lose people in your neighborhood. You start to lose power. You start to lose retail, the food, the banks, and all those other institutions. And then it becomes a vicious cycle to try and get people to move back in. So in some ways, let us look at neighborhoods getting in front of this topic of who's moving in. Let's empower them to actually figure out that they have the power to know who's going to move in next door. Call your cousin Joe Jr., move in next door, or call your coworker that you really like to move in next door. And let's empower them to figure out that they can be in front of who's moving into their neighborhood right now.
I would kind of agree that gentrification isn't really useful unless we contextualize it. It always has to be located in a place. It always has to be contextualized. And I kind of define it as, bad development, development without a heart, development that lacks transparency, development that does not consult the people in a neighborhood. I teach my students what gentrification is, and then I don't let them use that word when they go to interview people and residents in neighborhoods. Unless that person brings it up first, then you can talk about gentrification. Because I think what does it mean? It means different things to different people. I had someone ask me one time when we were at a preservation, well, what's so wrong with gentrification? Some people see it as a positive, some people see it as a negative. What's really important, and I completely agree, is empowering people to have a voice in what happens in their neighborhood. And that's where we get the bad development and the development without a heart. When people kind of come in, or this idea that we need to bring 10,000 families into Baltimore City. It's great to bring people into Baltimore City, but we have to think about the thousands and thousands of families that are in Baltimore City right now and ask them what they think, ask them what they need. They have voices, I promise you. They have plenty to say, so we need to listen.
So we've talked a little bit about this issue of declining population and how that plays out on the ground. I wonder if you could think a little bit more about how that's being lived, how's that being experienced, that sort of decline in population, and then also the changeover that's happening in the neighborhoods that we've highlighted here. I wonder if you could give specific examples about the impacts of that decline alongside the sort of changeover as well.
Want to start this way?
All right, we'll start this way now. Well, deindustrialization, I'll come back to that. When manufacturing and jobs left Baltimore City, people left Baltimore City. When cars in the suburbs developed, people left Baltimore City. A certain type of people left Baltimore City. That's why I think we should value the people who stayed in Baltimore City if it was a choice or if they stayed because they didn't have a choice. So I think that's the really important thing. I also think that we were doing some interviews and and one of the podcasts that my students put together, which you can find at baltimoretraces.umbc.edu. That's my radio voice. So you can hear people talking about these things on the ground. We were talking to some people outside of Lexington Market, and they were like, the Hopkins controls the east side, University of Maryland controls the west side. They're just going to take over the whole city. And I would say, like, Micah and Hopkins, the university, not the hospital, will take over the middle. And that's really important. We're at a university right now. There's this idea of eds and meds as a form of gentrification, that's who we're bringing back. We're bringing back doctors, we're bringing back students, we're bringing young professionals. And as I said in the article that our PR person wrote about this, people talk about bringing the millennials, and Freddie Gray was a millennial, and Freddie Gray was here. So I'll end there.
We have to think about how population loss has occurred every decade for the last 6 decades, because the issue is different for every decade. In the 1950s, you start to lose people because of the highway system and suburbanization, and unfortunately only white people were allowed to move out because they were able to get a mortgage, and most African American families were not allowed to move out because they couldn't get the capital to move out. So the 50s is about sprawl and the highway system and the cars and all that stuff that we're getting. The 60s, we have a lot of civil unrest that occurs, and people start to flee because of that. The 70s is economic restructuring and globalization, the jobs leaving the country. The 80s, we have the drug epidemic happening in the city. The 90s is like all of it happening at the same time. And then we have, I would say, kind of structural, there's a reason why we have this whole west side of Baltimore is losing population. The whole west side. These are variable neighborhoods, some including really nice neighborhoods like 10 Hills is not being able to attract people to move in. Really excellent quality of the housing stock. Ashburton, one of the kind of nicest African-American historic neighborhoods in the west side, is not being able to attract people. So we have to look at what's going on now. All of those things are still true. We've got suburbanization, we've got urban flaw, we've got a drug epidemic. We have all those things compounded, but there's something even more new now in the 21st century that we also need to combat, which is the fact that we are the only East Coast city that does not have a rich and robust transit and transportation system. It is just hard to get around in Baltimore City, and how are we going to compete with Washington, D.C., and Boston, and New York, Philadelphia, that has a really rich network of places where you don't need to own a car if you live in Washington, D.C. You have to own a car if you live in Baltimore. And I will say, even amongst immigrant populations that come to a city, they're looking for a carless life. This is what it's like in other countries and around them. So unfortunately, we keep compounding the issues in Baltimore, and just when we think we might have fixed one thing, there's something new on the horizon. And that's what I think we have to make sure that's what the data is useful for. Like, what are the preconditions and the early warning signs that we might continue to lose population? There's excellent neighborhoods here on the west side, but you would never go to that west side unless you're going to that west side. Right now, what people do is go around. You go around on 695 from downtown. You don't take Liberty Avenue anymore. You don't take I-40 anymore. You don't take Washington Boulevard out of the city. You just go around. And if you've ever watched the movie Cars, anybody that has kids here, there's that little town called Radiator Springs. It's on Route 66, and it slowly starts to die because everybody's taking the highway. This is our Radiator Springs. There's just not enough eyes on the west side of town, which actually has decent housing stock, but just not enough people looking at it.
So again, from the perspective of the Latino community that I do research with, if you Google Baltimore immigration, you will find a lot of news stories about how Baltimore has been revitalized by immigrant communities, at least certain neighborhoods in Baltimore that definitely has happened. And I showed you earlier some numbers about how gentrification has actually diminished the ethnic diversity in those neighborhoods, that immigrants are being displaced by rising housing costs. This is something that in my research I came across with tangentially. I was not doing research on gentrification, but then in my focus groups, immigrants were complaining a lot about rising housing costs in Southeast Baltimore. And the problem with that, in terms of how this community has experienced gentrification, is that for immigrant communities with geographic concentration and the formation of ethnic neighborhoods comes not only, it's not just a matter of living in a place, and so when you are displaced, it's not just an economic problem of moving from a neighborhood that has high rent to a neighborhood where rent is lower, because with that concentration comes community life, comes cultural placemaking, comes a network of service providers that are culturally competent, comes political clout. And all that is undermined when you have gentrification leading to displacement. Now, in terms of solutions or possible remedies that we can have to how immigrant communities have been affected by gentrification, I would say first, expand the programs that we have in the city for immigrant home ownership, for assistance, because it's if it's challenging for an American citizen to buy a house, you can imagine how much more challenging it can be for an immigrant that just arrived in the country. We could also further expand the programs that we already have for immigrant entrepreneurship and immigrant workforce development. So it's just a matter of building up on the programs that we already have, and that's something that can help immigrant families increase their incomes, experience some upward social mobility, and sort of protect themselves, become less vulnerable to the negative effects of gentrification. I think, however, we should also acknowledge that there is only so much we can do on the local level. So if you ask me what is the best thing that we can do for immigrant communities to be protected from the negative effects of gentrification, I would say that's federal immigration reform. So we have to acknowledge that gentrification is social inequality reproduced on the urban space, and this social inequality is systemic, so the solution has to be multi-level.
Well, when I think of Baltimore's depopulation, especially when you start in 1950, when we almost had 1 million people, I think you have to think about the phenomenon. We have to say it very clearly, white flight. Baltimore had about 700,000 white people that lived in the city, about 200,000 African Americans. So we were almost at 1 million. Well, between 1950 and roughly 2010, Baltimore's white population craters until about 200,000 whites. And so Baltimore City loses 500,000 white people. And why would white people begin to leave the city in 1950? What was happening in the 50s? Just so happened there was a famous Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education. The desegregation of our public schools. White people did not want to send their children to school with black children. So they began to leave. And when they do so, they're subsidized by the federal government. Federal government says, hey, you want housing? We got housing. Federal Housing Administration, Veterans Administration, they provide exclusionary loans to whites. Then they say, well, how are you going to get to those homes? We're going to build you highways. So Eisenhower, Federal Highway Act, 1956, highways, $55 billion, subsidized transit for whites to get in and out of the city. So these are, if you read Ira Katznelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was White, he details that this was a bountiful advantage from the federal government given to whites to move out to the suburbs where black people were left in the city. So when we talk about depopulation, it's kind of like we often blame black people. We weren't the ones who left the city. White people left the city. And now they want to come back, and that's gentrification. And there's a subsidy for that too. So they were subsidized to leave and then subsidized to come back in. And in the meantime, black people are living in these red line black communities. The reason why there's no transit out there is partially because people rebelled against the highway that was supposed to be built. US 40, y'all know it as y'all heard of that, the highway to nowhere? 1.9 mile stretch in West Baltimore, built a crater in the middle of West Baltimore, split Baltimore, black Baltimore into two. And actually, if you look at the ironically named MLK, it wrapped a boundary around Midtown and split Midtown from West Baltimore, further intensifying racial segregation. So a lot of what we're talking about, it makes no sense if you don't look at and understand hyper-segregation. Baltimore is category 5. We're among the worst of the worst. We never desegregated. We never desegregated, even though last Wednesday was the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. We are persistently racist as a city, even though you have black political leadership. And we have to remember, Baltimore was actually majority white until the 70s. So the urban policies we're talking about is a legacy of a majority white city at the time, and now you have a political class, a black political class that we must say is often beholden to white capital that perpetuates Baltimore apartheid. So I think let's put depopulation in that context, a context of white flight being subsidized by the federal government, and then black people in the city often not having the investment to build up their communities until white people want to come back in, and then all of a sudden the investment reappears.
At this point, we would like to open up the floor to questions. So we only have a couple of mics, so if you could speak up, I'd encourage you to do that. I'd help facilitate some of the questions going on right now, too. So. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Ashley Minner. I am a native person from Southeast Baltimore. What's up, Dr. Brown? Hey, Mr. Glenn. Meaning I'm American Indian from Southeast Baltimore, all green on that map. And I would like to ask you scholars, what happens after gentrification? Like, what's the next thing?
DC, San Francisco, Seattle, that these Baltimore in 20 years is happening in Atlanta, it's almost there. It loses its status as a chocolate city, becomes a cappuccino city, becomes becomes a latte city, people of color get pushed out. And this is, America since 1492 after Columbus sailed the ocean blue and European settlers came and they displaced people. Like this is, this is not new. That when white people get interested in valuable land, people of color suffer.
So I heard this, I don't know if there's any research on it, and maybe somebody else does, but I think this is an interesting way to think about what's after gentrification. If you look at cities that have exploded in terms of economic development, like a San Francisco, like even a New York City, where do we see the poorer, disinvested households that are getting displaced? Strong market cities, like in New York or San Francisco, tends to see poverty in a ring around the city, right? You get displaced and you go out in the ring around the city. We are what's called a weak market city, and other weak market cities like Detroit or Cleveland, you see the ring inside, right in the middle of our downtown. So the one benefit that we have is that all of unfortunately, the entire regional area, most low-income persons of color are living in the city of Baltimore. The good news is that one jurisdiction, and we can rise up as one jurisdiction and potentially have some political clout. In the other places like San Francisco, when you do the ring around, you're in multiple jurisdictions. And to try and build a coalition across different counties is actually even harder. So not to say that, I don't know what's better, the ring around the city that forms when we have displacement versus what we have right now, which is, a centralized set of not yet displaced, potentially, neighborhoods. But so in terms of how can we prevent that from happening, we must follow the money. You must follow the money. Wherever we put any kind of capital investment in the city of Baltimore, we must make sure that we preserve affordable housing and protect the people that are there right now. People don't believe that a neighborhood is going to become, high income. People didn't believe that Canton today is our #1 median sales price. 15 years ago, nobody would have said that about Canton, but it's today our #1. So what happened when we reconstructed Boston Street? We should have been preserving affordable housing 10, 15 years ago. Right now, we're going to be reconstructing North Avenue, which is the Station North neighborhoods and going across into Reservoir Hill and Bolton Hill. We need to be preserving affordable housing right now. And it seems unlikely that those are going to explode in housing, but our data is showing that's exactly what's going to happen.
Hi, Ed Orser and panelists have made some really wonderful points, and yet I sense some different definition of gentrification among you. And I'd like to ask the panel, what's your message to this audience in terms of the future of Baltimore? Would you love to have this audience settling in Baltimore? And if they did, would that be bad because it would be gentrification? I'd really like to have you address that.
I'll take that one, or I'll start that. There's a great book, Mark Lamont Hill and a couple other white guys, I can't remember their names, did called Gentrifier, where they really, it's like a popular book where they talk about how they are gentrifiers, and I think that we all need to I live in downtown Baltimore. I don't have a car, and I work in the county. I think, number one, we need to cooperate between county and city, and those of you know I'm like hyper love the city, but I do work in the county. But we also need to understand that neighborhoods are always changing. I am a gentrifier. I've said it. I don't own a home, so I live in an apartment. I don't own a car, and those are intentional things. But I am a white, youngish, 40-something-ish professional who moved to Baltimore City from somewhere else. And so I feel like it's on me that's the listening thing, to come to a place and be respectful of that place. But I think it's a really good point that we need to all admit that we are talking about something that we are all in. And the level of purity and to call people out is not productive, that we need to work together. And we need to listen to some people. And my friend with the Gentrification Stole Our History, I Am Pissed, who is doing the work, we need to listen to Nia as well. So, thanks.
I would say unequivocally, yes, please come and live in Baltimore City. That's the number one thing that we could use. But for anybody that currently lives in Baltimore City right now, you have the power. You have the power to welcome those people in. You have the power to bring in the, banana nut bread or whoever when they move in, and make sure that they understand they're coming into your fold. It's not the other way around, right? But I think they're looking to figure out how to come into your fold. They want to know how to become a part of the neighborhood. I don't know if anybody's heard about the 6th branch, which is former veterans that have come into Oliver. And if anybody knows Nina Harper, who's kind of the grandmother of Oliver, she was actually quite angry that the 6th branch did not ask her first of whether or not they were going to rehabilitate the housing stock. Now, from the outside, former veterans saying, hey, we've just rehabilitated Afghanistan, we can rehabilitate Oliver. Sounds awesome, right? But for Nina Harper, it was exactly that. It was a deflection of her authority as being kind of the grand dame of the neighborhood. And so if you do move in, I hope you do. I hope you choose any one of our neighborhoods. I hope you spread out. And when you do, I hope you respect and take advantage of the history that's there and get into the fold. And conversely, if you're already living in the neighborhood, welcome people. Welcome people in, bring them in, let them know that they are a part of a new community that will form with them involved.
And be a good gentrifier and join a neighborhood association, a community association, and help shape the policies in a different direction from that. So I'm always getting into fights on Facebook because I'm defending Baltimore from everyone that lives around and criticizes Baltimore all the time. And I'm a Baltimore enthusiast, so yes, move to Baltimore.
So, I think that's a very interesting question. I think words take on different meaning if you're on the top of that power dynamic versus being on the bottom of that power dynamic. So if you brought up the term manifest destiny about 300 years ago, like, you're gonna feel pretty positive about it if you're on the top of that power dynamic, right? Like, hey, let's settle new land, we get to go across and claim our territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean, But if you're on the bottom of that power dynamic, manifest destiny sounds a little bit differently. It becomes a daggone near a cursed phrase, like you don't like it. So I think the relationality to policies, for instance, urban renewal later in the 50s and 60s, urban renewal sounds really nice, really good if you're on the top of the power dynamic, right? But like if you're on the bottom and urban renewal disproportionately displaced African Americans across this country, if you're on the bottom of that dynamic, you get someone like James Baldwin saying that urban renewal is Negro removal. So it's defined differently. And I think gentrification has that same flavor and feel to it, where people that are on the top of that dynamic, gentrification, this is great, la la la, we love it. It's not so bad, isn't it a good thing? But when you're on the bottom of the power dynamic, when you've been displaced over and over and over again, being pushed to the edge, gentrification sounds like, wait a minute, that's urban renewal 2.0. We've been pushed out of our land again. This is colonization all over again. So I think the difference in definition depends on where you stand in terms of the power dynamic in relationship to that term. So yeah.
Well, I think that to that point, I think we, the scholars and those of us that are looking at policy, must encourage the city to be protecting people now, not when it's too late. We don't have an affordable housing strategy in the city of Baltimore. We have 25,000 people today that are on a housing assistance wait list. We go to bed every night knowing that 25,000 households, if not more, the wait list is closed, have no idea if they're housing stable. So until we make sure that we protect everybody in the city of Baltimore from a policy perspective, from a funding perspective, from a capital investing perspective, even though you innocently might come into a neighborhood, you might be doing more injustice because we don't have those protections in place. So we have to do both. Right.
I think the other thing I'll add to that is also, Baltimore is very good at kicking people out of their homes. If you read the Baltimore Sun, last year they had an investigative series called Dismissed. They said Baltimore was #1 in the rental eviction per capita. If you read Melody Simmons' Baltimore Business Journal a couple years ago, she said we were #4 in foreclosure filings. So whether you're a renter or a homeowner, you're very likely, or Baltimore is very good at kicking people out, while at the same time welcoming other people in. Now, who's been kicked out of their homes? Let's look at the median annual income by race. In Baltimore City, the median annual white income is $60,000, roughly $60,000. The median annual household income for black people in Baltimore is like $33,000. We're at half. Black people are at half the median annual household income compared to whites in Baltimore City. A lot of that's due to the racial wealth gap and also the racial income gap. But black people are the ones that are being more likely to be pushed. Don't push me, cause I'm close.
Hi, Ms. King, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Nia Bretman, and I brought you some information on what happened in the aftermath of gentrification. This is proof of that.
Mike?
What happens is they steal our history.
Here you go. I'll hold some time for you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for being open. And Dr. Lawrence, I'm glad to see you here. This is our story. Catherine Benton Jones is in the back. She represents Old Town Mall Development, the Perkins Homes Development. Her name of her group is Change for Real. We have joined forces because I come out of the EBDI footprint area, and we know what happened down there. So a young man this morning called me named Leon Purnell, and I told him I was coming here. He said, Nia, what are the people going to do when you finally tell the real story about what happened down there? Because it makes some books pale in comparison to what we know, Professor Brown. Okay? What happened down there is that was a neighborhood. Who lived there? Wet nurses lived there. I did not know what a wet nurse was until I went to a community meeting and I had announced the East Baltimore Historical Library. And we wanted to capture the history of black people in that neighborhood. And an elderly lady said, well, I'd be there because I was a wet nurse. I didn't know what a wet nurse was. I said, what is a wet nurse? She says, Hopkins would come down and pick us up to come up to the hospital when doctors' wives' breast milk had drawn up and they couldn't nurse their babies. So we became the nurses of the children, babies, born by white doctors at Johns Hopkins. That's a story that needs to be preserved. That lady's 92 years old now, and I haven't gotten the means to get around to all these 90-year-olds when they leave that area. The next situation, you had the lead paint situation, the experiment. That was the neighborhood, folks. It was Middle East. They were our babies. I was glad to see Glenn Ross here. Glenn Ross knows the story about what happened when the people wanted to have a summer garden. And they partnered with the largest anchor institution in our area. And what did that anchor institution do? Mr. Ross, did they not volunteer to donate the fertilizer? What happens 20 years later when you find out that fertilizer that they donated was sludge with all sorts of carcinogenics in it that would kill people? This is our story. We want our story preserved so that scholars like yourself, when you do the research, you will hear the voices of Lucille Gorham. You will hear the stories from Nia Redmond. You will find out what happened in a neighborhood, God forbid, named Middle East. Now, they certainly don't want the neighborhood to remain named Middle East because nobody wants to buy a home down there. But it was a microcosm of really what happened in the real Middle East. Folks, we need help. That's why I came today, to let you know. We have a Facebook page called East Baltimore Historical Library. We have another one called the National Gentrification Museum. You're talking to a person that if I wear a watch, it's a Timex. I'm not in the digital age at all. But I do know language. I do know what I read. I know that this whole technology, virtual reality, is your world. What we'd like you to do is open the door so it can become our world too. We're talking about a digital national gentrification library that will become a repository for gentrification happening all over this country. Nia Redmond, Catherine Benton-Jones, we may not know how to do it. I'm just taking my first computer class last week. But we know that you young people know how to do it. Don't tell us don't dream, because we're dreaming. We have been able to be awarded $300,000, Dr. Brown, in public bond bill money. We have fought to hold on to that money for the last 5 years while I was care providing for my 97-year-old mom who left last year. We need young, bright people to come stand with us. This is the last battle, and that battle is to preserve our history. In 1973, a school burnt down. That was an elementary school that served, as my mother, she left here calling us colored people. When my mother said, oh, that was the school for the colored people. Well, the building burnt down. Thank goodness that we had academicians who came out of East Baltimore that advocated for another educational site to be on that location. They couldn't get an elementary school built because the population had decreased. What they got put there was a primary school. Lo and behold, you meet up with a 90-year-old woman who was the first principal of that primary school. When she found out we were trying to create a history library, she said, Nia, whatever you do, tell people that you meet that if they went to elementary school number 135, their names, all the teachers' names, all the principals' names are in a time capsule in the cornerstone of that building that's there. What's the name of that primary school? It was Luther Craven Mitchell. Who was Luther Craven Mitchell? He was certainly before my time, and I'm 67. He was the head of the history department at Dunbar High School. Now, somebody was thinking in 1973 to put the names of children in the time capsule and the teachers. It's in the building that EBDI is occupying, Mr. Brown. We want to serve them eminent domain notice. We want that building to honorably house the history of the people they moved out of that neighborhood. And you've never heard a whisper about, that's the neighborhood where the lead paint experiments went. They don't know Nia Redmond has a video where the judge who came down and met, this judge came to meet with us on the corner of Rutland Avenue, the same judge that made the decision that compared what happened to our children down there with the Tuskegee experiment. He didn't want anybody to know he was there. He snuck in one night and he let us video him, and he talked about it. That's something we want to put in that library. That this man came, and this man was what? He was in the Supreme Court. He came all the way down to the real hood to talk to us at nighttime to tell us why he made that decision. Right now, folks, if we can't convince young people This is not a black-white issue. This is a humanity issue. I've always had John Browns in my life. Most of the things I've done in life, John Brown has always shown up. We'd like to invite you. An email address is eastbaltimore101@gmail.com. Our Facebook page is East Baltimore Historical Library. We need young scholars to come and help us create that digital library. I thank you very much for this opportunity.
So thank you so much for talking about the history of that neighborhood. And I was thinking about it. I was down in that neighborhood and thinking about how Hopkins and FD have used history as to market the place, but their own kind of history. So they have this sign at 855 North Wolf Street, which now houses, I think it's housing for graduate students there and medical students. And they have this quotation from George Washington Carver etched on the building: "Since new developments are the products of a creative mind, we must therefore stimulate and encourage that type of mind in every way possible." Forest City New East Baltimore Partnership expresses its gratitude and respect to the men and women whose talents are invested in this building and honors the generations of East Baltimore families whose legacies serve as its foundation. Right, and then Iyer Park has, which they now sort of rebranded, right? It's just a branding strategy. Is sort of marketing the history as a way to almost justify the redevelopment that it's done. And so, how do we get your history to be the history rather than the way that Hopkins or really developers will now use history as a marketing tool? Like, come here because of this deep, rich history that we've that we've just cemented right over. And it's so frustrating. I don't know if I have a question as much as a frustration at the kind of work that we do as academicians to sort of talk about the history, but the way that's taken up and marketed and depresses the kind of history that you're doing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if it's a question.
It's a beautiful comment, young lady, and let me tell you what, we just simply need your help. Every gentrified neighborhood needs black, white, Asian, Latino. We need scholars like yourselves to show up. We don't need you to show up to just do your thesis dissertation. We've had that. I have proof of the young people. I always had a children's program that operated in a garage. We were the only after-school program in 88 acres, because it was 88 acres. We actually didn't understand why there were no playgrounds, why there were no after-school programs. So we opened our own. Once we understood nobody's going to help us, it took us a year to raise enough money to put a children's newspaper into every elementary middle school in Baltimore. In fact, when the mayor came in that neighborhood and found out we were located in that neighborhood, he said, "I had no idea this paper was coming out of this neighborhood." Right now, folks, we need you. The missing piece is you. Young people on college campuses that have the wherewithal to help us tell our stories, and not only tell our stories, but save our stories. We want ownership of our stories. We don't want people interpreting our history. Great history came out of that neighborhood. You had Leon Lyles, the Arabs came out of that neighborhood. June Solomon, the only person that unionized Arabs all across this city. He came right out of that neighborhood. There's no plaque there that's saying June Solomon came out of that neighborhood. But there is a letter written by former Mayor Kirk Schmoke that was read at this man's funeral that acknowledged the fact that during the late 40s, a man named June Solomon, who lived in that neighborhood, organized the Arabs throughout Baltimore City. So how you help, and I'm going to give you back your mic, how you help is that please get with Ms. King. Ms. King, thank you for hearing me this morning. We need every one of you in this room. You're going to make the difference. You're going to make the difference. It's no longer Nia standing there. It's no longer Catherine Benton. We now have scholars that can help us tell our story. They're asking us now, well, Nia, what do you want? And we're saying we want you to name that biotech park after Henrietta Lacks. That's what we want. Okay?
So we are quickly approaching the end of our time together. So I'm going to actually turn back to our panelists for just a moment in the wake of those words and just ask our panelists to maybe reflect on what is one thing that you would leave us with that we could do as researchers, as collaborators, as activists, as residents, to think about how to address some of these questions moving forward.
I'd say show up and listen. Show up and listen.
So when I went back to the analogy of when you look at your body and you get your vital signs from the doctors, most of the things that you see are healthy, right? It's the things that are not so healthy that you're going to focus on in the next year, right? If your iron levels are low, you're going to do something. If your vitamin D levels are low. Every single one of our neighborhoods has something that is not in balance. And in gentrifying neighborhoods like the ones that we've talked about, the thing that's out of balance is that the people that were there to begin with are no longer there. So, or they are feeling displaced because of rising housing prices. So to, Dr. Brown's point, that all of us have a responsibility to actually live together and actually integrate and not try and keep moving away from each other. And Baltimore has actually some really great examples of where this is really happening, where people are learning to live together. We're all trying to formulate a community. And so, for example, in Canton, after the 2015 uprisings, a lot of people said, how can we go help Sandtown Winchester? And my answer is, you don't need to go to Sandtown Winchester to help Sandtown Winchester. You need to make sure that there's affordable housing in your neighborhood right now, so there isn't the pressure cooker that happens in a neighborhood like Sandtown Winchester. How can you, in Canton, unfortunately too late, make sure that you can have folks that are on subsidized housing live in your house, in your neighborhood, and be proactive about it and be an advocate for it and stop saying no. And each one of us probably can think about our own neighborhoods and make sure that we truly are a welcoming place, we understand and are an inclusive, welcoming place, and make sure that anybody can potentially live in your neighborhood right now. And that's the antidote to having these kind of pressurized situations where you can only go to certain neighborhoods because those are the ones that you feel like you can get into.
I think this event is such a great call for community-based research. I do community-based research, and it's something that I think can be a very important vehicle for social justice advocacy that is methodologically rigorous, that is evidence-based, and inclusive of the community. So not just to benefit someone writing a dissertation or a thesis, but a true collaboration between communities and universities. I would say that an ideal community-based research project is one that you cannot really distinguish whether it is a community project with a research component or a research project with a community component, because it has to be both. And I think it starts with conversations like this to build relationships that can nurture that type of social justice advocacy that is based on research.
So I think the thing that I would say is, first of all, remembering that, gentrification, forced displacement, results in this erasure that Ms. Redmond talked about. But beyond all the statistics we gave you, results in like calling a community, rebranding it Eager Park as opposed to Middle East. Now you've erased the name of it and you've erased the history of the people in it that used to live there. And so you see that and watch that dynamic. And so I would say, after you remember that, join with the effort that Ms. Redmond and our other sister from Perkins Homes they're involved in, support them, and also think about, the fact that your tax dollars are being used to subsidize the type of displacement that masquerades as development in Baltimore, even if you don't live in Baltimore, because state dollars and federal dollars are pumped into communities to make sure this redevelopment happens. So you've got to be engaged politically wherever you are and tell your representative in the state house, in the state legislature, in your city where you are, I don't want this type of development. We've got to change our policies and make sure that development is indicative of racial equity and social justice.
Well, me and thank you, our panelists.